So I'm talking today with one of my past professors, Dr. Williams, who is an anthropology professor and the director of the Dania Beach Vervet project. And so, professor, or do you like to be called doctor? I don't know.
You can call me Missy. It's fine.
Missy. So, what is the class that you're teaching right now?
I'm
About,
teaching the Introduction to Anthropology course, the one that you took.
do you get a lot of students, like a lot of people enrolling, or?
It's always about the same, maybe 22 to 25 students every
Mhm.
class. And I don't know what the max enrollment is. Is it 25 or 30? But it's always a small class, so it's nice. You get to know the
Mhm.
students.
And how are students nowadays, like compared to maybe like 10 years ago? Has there been any change or?
I think students are more socially aware. Does that make sense? And I think it's because of social media and the different media platforms that they have access to. So the information, whether it's misinformation or accurate, it's
Mhm.
there. And they believe whatever it is typically. So I do try to teach them how to fact check. That's my new thing.
Yeah.
So I do a section on fake news and misinformation and how to spot that when you're reading an article. So I think that's become really important and relevant, I think, for students today.
No, definitely I agree with that. That was gonna be one of my questions because ever since I've been out of school, it's not like I haven't, kept on learning. I try to keep, reading. I'm still interested in, human study, and whether it's not really technically anthropology is I focus more on maybe like politics or history, learning stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that falls into anthropology. Anthropology is such a broad field, you know?
Yeah. So it's just so but I end up, reading things or watching certain things, but it's important to always check the sources. It's not always easy to even know how to do that.
No, I agree. And even the sources that seem legitimate, sometimes I find that they might cherry pick data or take something and put it into their own narrative,
Hmm.
take it out of context. So it's tricky. It is definitely a tricky road to navigate nowadays, for sure.
Yeah. Have you heard of the Taino people from the Caribbean?
I have. I don't know if you remember one of the students, Mariah. She was in the primate class. She did a study on them, and I remember learning a little bit about them through her project.
No. Yeah, I bring them up just because that's something that I'm reading now, a book. I think it's outdated though. But trying to learn a little bit more because that's where my dad's from is Cuba, so I like to learn a little bit about the history over there.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, your family history,
Yeah.
genealogy. Very cool.
Yeah. And yeah, it's an interesting history. I mean, people have been on those islands for long before, the Europeans came over there.
I agree. And I think people forget about that too,
Mm.
and I think it is a topic that isn't discussed much. And I don't know why. But it does need to be out there because you really don't hear about it that much, not unless you're, like you mentioned, it's maybe part of your family history or someone just does a study on it. But if you were to ask, I think the average person, if you have you heard of the Tainos,
Mm.
they wouldn't know what you're talking about.
It's true. It's true. Um, I watched that little documentary that you did with on I don't know how to pronounce the island, Saint Martin,
Oh yeah, St. Martin, yes.
Saint Martin, and that was a good documentary. I
Oh,
like what
thank
you
you.
did with it. What is the like backstory of how the Vervet population got to the island over there?
So the Burvitts were brought in during the slave trade in the 1600s, and I believe, they were originally on St. Kitts and Nevis. And then just because the population is growing, they've ended up island hopping. So they're spreading throughout the Caribbean now. And people don't like that. They claim that they're non-native or invasive or whatever, but I always like to remember that humans have been modifying and shaping the ecosystem and the landscape for thousands of years. So it's not really fair to penalize the animals just because they're a byproduct of that.
Mm-hmm. No, and they if they mess with the environment, it's at such a small scale compared to what we do.
Oh, I agree. And people always remove themselves from being part of the problem. Humans,
Hmm.
we never consider ourselves invasive or anything like that. And all the problems that we have today stem from humans. That's my
Yeah.
argument. So,
No, I agree. I agree with that a lot.
yeah.
I was re like going over what I highlighted in this book here that you
Oh, yes. I remember that book. It's awesome. You still have it.
yeah, I still have a lot of the textbooks.
Nice.
And there was a part about anthropocentrism and how it's hard for us to get out of that mindset of even giving other animals human motives and qualities, and it's hard for us because I mean we're just so human focused, human centric.
Yes, we are. Yeah, we're very egocentric species, 100%.
Hmm.
I
And
agree with that.
yeah, I think you and your classes and anthropology in general help me think about stuff like that, like getting out of the human sort of way of the ego, a little bit.
Oh, good. Yeah. I try to get that across to students. I think it's so easy for us to get caught up in our everyday life that we don't think about how much we actually impact the things going on around us and that we're accountable for a lot of those behaviors. And for some odd reason, people just ignore that. They choose to ignore it. I think some people actively say that, if you mention, oh, humans are the invasive species, people kind of laugh that off. But not recognizing that, I think it's a huge part of the problem.
Yeah. Are there any updates on the situation on St. Martin of the
No,
monkey?
it's been crickets. I don't know what's going on. They don't like me down there, which is fine. I can live with that. I'm just glad I brought some attention to the issue.
Yeah.
I think it's a secret of what's going on the island. The government's killing them. The government gave funding to the Nature Foundation, and the Nature Foundation knows, I guess, that it's not really politically correct to do that. I don't even know if that's the right word, but I feel like they know that it's just a bad PR move to do something like that. And for some odd reason, they refuse to accept any outsider help, which I thought was weird. So all the money that they got from the government, they could have given that back to the government or used it differently instead of using it to kill the monkeys. A lot of organizations came together and said, hey, we'll figure out how to mitigate current behavioral problems. We can sterilize the population. And they didn't really seem to be open to any of those ideas or outsider
Mm-hmm.
ideas. Yeah. So it was very frustrating when I thought it was a solution. It's complicated. I get that. However, I think working with other organizations globally, I think is good, right? So you collaborate together and you come to a solution that's makes everybody happy. There's always some compromise, but they just weren't open to any cooperation type of meetings at all.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. To me too, it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially because a lot of the people that you interviewed seem to, just be okay with the presence of the monkeys. We're used to like them even.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to me, it would attract people to the island, if anything,
Yeah, I follow a lot of the Facebook pages for St. Martin tourism. And the other day, someone posted, where can I see the monkeys? I heard you have monkeys. I want to see them.
Hmm.
And I think they're also missing, like you said, a huge opportunity to generate some tourism based on, wild monkey tours or something like that. I think
Hmm.
St. Kitts and Nevis, they do that. If you look at some of their activities you can schedule when you go there, they do have those things. So they've gotten the idea of like, well, they're here. We just got to make the best of it. And they figured out a way to use the population for a positive perspective. I mean, I don't always agree with exploiting for monkeys. However, in situations like this, I think it's something that can be useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what is the Dania Beach Vervet project for any potential listeners?
The Dania Vervet Project promotes conservation and compassion for the wild monkeys that live in Dania Beach, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So, and awareness about the population. I think a lot of the locals who've been in Broward County, for years know that there is a wild monkey population. However, we're seeing a lot of people moving into the state and into those areas, so they aren't aware that there are wild monkeys running around Broward County.
Mm-hmm. And what is the backstory of the Vervets being there and Dania Beach?
So there was something called the Anthropoid Research Foundation that was opened in the early 40s by Layla Roosevelt and her partner Armand Dennis. They were importing primates in for biomedical use, and also at the same time there was a space in Dania Beach that they used as a tourist attraction, right? So the people come in, pay to see the animals, and that would help offset the cost of having the animals on site. And the chimps and the vervet monkeys were used for the biomedical trade.
Yeah.
So, and then not a handful, they said, I talked to a gentleman who did a documentary about the early vervet population in the 90s. It was great. So I spoke with him, and he had mentioned that either the keeper that was working that day forgot to lock the latch on the monkey enclosure or the monkeys opened it. And so they all got out and they got all of them back but 12 to 15. So the monkeys that we see today come from those little escapees.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. I bet money that they figured out how to open the latch. I put money on that. They're
Yeah.
so smart.
Yeah, that's smart. Very smart.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They're very crafty.
What's the average lifespan of a Vervet monkey?
In captivity, it can be 20, 25, 30 years, depending on the type of care that the individual receives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And wild, I'm guessing like maybe 15 to 20 or
Yeah, it's lower, depending on where they live. A lot of the animals, in endemic areas, even in the Caribbean, people kill them because they're pests. Then they're also part of the food chain, the natural food chain in Africa.
yeah.
So I call them like the Snicker bars of Africa. I just
Mhm.
feel like, birds of prey eat them, big cats, constrictors will eat them, people will eat them, and then they're also hunted just because of their presence in human spaces.
Yeah. And they're on the smaller side for monkeys, no?
Yeah, yeah, they're small compared to, if you think about a baboon, vervet monkeys, the ones that we have, the wild monkeys, we have them males because the males are larger than the females. When we weighed the males on average, maybe 12, 13 pounds, and the females are a little bit smaller, about 8 or 9 pounds.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they look bigger, I think, because of that long tail.
Yeah.
Yeah, people when they do see them, they're like, "Oh my God, I saw a monkey and it was 3 feet tall." I'm like, "No, no, no, it wasn't. It looks like it, but not wasn't 3 feet tall."
Yeah. Um, how has the Vervet project grown since the beginning?
Oh wow. Once I finished my doctorate, I really pushed to open a sanctuary just because of the welfare issues. They really don't have any welfare protections in place here in the state of Florida because of their non-native status.
Mhm.
And I was finding that, if a monkey was injured or if it's trapped as a nuisance, the only alternatives were either euthanasia or, FWC would have to find someone with the appropriate permit to take them. However, typically those people with the permit who agreed to take them participated in the pet trade. And I didn't think that was good either. So that's really what pushed me to open the sanctuary, to take in those animals to avoid being euthanized or being used in the pet trade.
Mhm. And the sanctuary, how does it keep on running? Like, do you get like donations and stuff like that?
Sometimes we'll get some local people who will donate. But typically it's self-funded. So, I still teach at the college, so that helps pay for some of the costs.
Yeah.
We received a grant from SPCA International 2 years in a row. Community Foundation Broward has given us a grant. So we do get grants here and there. However, we do rely typically on donations from the
Mm.
community. So,
And what are some challenges that you face doing this work?
oh boy, there's a list. Let me tell you, there is a list. Um, what I didn't expect when I opened the sanctuary was to be contacted to take surrendered pet monkeys. This is a problem. I did not anticipate that. I knew pet monkeys were out there. They were just really off my radar. I was more concerned about the wild monkeys.
Mhm.
However, as soon as people realized that I had the appropriate permit and they were looking at my sanctuary philosophy, people decided to reach out to me to surrender their pets. And so that's been a big issue. And we're maxed out on space right now. I did have to decline to take another animal maybe 3 weeks ago.
Mhm.
So, and I hate saying no just because I don't know ultimately where the animal is going to end up. But because it goes back to the funding once again, it kind of limits, how many animals you can take in because you
Yeah.
want to make sure that the animals you do have are properly cared for mentally and
Mhm.
physically. So,
Yeah, very true.
yeah, so that is definitely one of the biggest unexpected challenges for sure.
Yeah. And on humans in general, like what are some common myths or maybe like misunderstandings that you've heard people repeat over the years about, humanity and how we are as a species and stuff like that? I'm sure you hear just in
Oh,
common,
like
like maybe like we've only existed for 5,000 years or
oh, I see. Yeah, I think evolution, the idea that we evolved over time is touchy for some people. However, I do think it's becoming more accepted. I've noticed that with the students that come through anthropology, that they actually do have some background in what evolution is and how it works, which makes it nice. So that is good to see that people are understanding that we're an animal and the rules of evolution apply to us as well.
Mhm. Yeah. I encounter those types of things too, 'cause I like to talk about this type of stuff with whoever will listen will listen.
Yeah.
But you hear certain misconceptions that people have, and I don't try to necessarily correct them all the time because then it'll just be a nuisance. But
Yeah. And some people don't want to listen and they're just going to believe what they want to believe, which is fine. You just have to, I guess, choose your battles with those people, right? The ones
Mhm.
who just don't, which is, that's the way life is, right? So,
What should the duty be of humans to care for or respect the space of certain monkey populations?
oh boy, I think it should go beyond just monkey populations. I think we've lost our connection with nature. And I think it's because of how industrialized we've become. And this, I think, it makes it so much easier for humans to reconcile destroying habitat to make room for growth for humans. So I think that's a problem, and I don't know how to fix that. You
Yeah.
know, I don't think people go out hiking anymore. There people do, but I find the more that people live in urban areas, the further removed they are from nature, right?
Mhm.
So, if you think about living in the city, you might see a raccoon here or there or a possum, and all of a sudden they get scared and they want it removed. And they don't realize that animal is actually part of the urban ecosystem, and each animal plays its part, has a role in the world around us.
No, that's something I think about a lot too.
Yeah, yeah. I always see people on next door. Oh my God, I saw a coyote. I'm like, yes, yeah, you did. They're urban animals. They live here. They're
Mhm.
like, well, we need to have it removed. Like, why? I'm scared of it. Well, coyotes are typically shy. They're great to keep the rodent population down. And what people don't realize is as soon as you remove a coyote, it kicks in the breeding, and then they will just replace the removed animal through cycling.
Mm.
So I always tell people removal doesn't work. It just recreates a vacant niche temporarily, and then new animals will move in. So people need to learn to live with wildlife, not get rid of it.
Yeah. And it's a global problem, right? I mean, the human not accepting that they're part of nature problem, because I mean, we're industrializing and tearing down all across the world and ever expanding, and then the resources are running dry, and it's becoming a harder world, for us and for everything else, and
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, this human wildlife conflict will always be a problem, and the more that we develop, it will only increase. So I think there needs to be more education on how to deal with wildlife in your space.
yeah. And how do you see the future for humanity going, maybe within this century?
Oh boy, I'm not the optimist when it comes to that. I find that there's too many people on the planet. And I really feel like we've lost our way, from a human perspective. There's a lot of violence towards each other nowadays, and I don't know if it's become more normalized because we see it in the news or on social media. People just accept it and say that's just the way it is. So I'm not hopeful, I don't think. I don't know. I hate saying that because I have a son and I'd like to think that his future, is a safe and secure one. However, I think just what I see globally happening, it's really sad.
Yeah, I see it similarly too.
Yeah.
I think I mean, I sometimes think, well, it's a culture thing, because within the culture, and it's a global culture now, but
Yeah.
that it's okay to keep processing, keep tearing down, forever expansion.
Yeah.
Humans are expanding,
Yeah.
and we don't consider sustainability.
No, no, we're a greedy species.
Yeah.
And we put ourselves first and foremost over everything, no matter what it compromises, I think.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know, there was, people argue, like you said, that it's inherent that we're greedy or that we're selfish just for the idea for being able to reproduce and move on, right? Your self-preservation is number one. Um, However, I think we need to be a little bit more enlightened and aware that we share the planet with other humans too, you
Hmm.
know. So, but yeah, it's just really sad to see the way that we treat each other nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah, because we have the capability for good. I mean, plenty of people are examples of that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it takes a lot of self-reflection, right? Or a tragic accident to happen to you before you realize the value of life,
Hmm.
you know, or an illness that is life threatening. People all of a sudden become very caring, and, but you should be doing those behaviors before you feel like, your morality is in jeopardy.
Yeah. What is something that you like to bring up to somebody who's not really focused on, let's say, anthropology, looking at the world through that lens?
It's hard. I think trying to find the hook to get someone interested just to start talking about the topic can be very difficult. And that, I think, has to do maybe with an age gap too, right? So it depends on who you're speaking with. The older generations, it could be difficult to get them to look at things differently because they've been around for so long and it's worked for them, that type of mentality. As for the younger generation, that one's tricky. I have my son, and, they're just priorities are very different at that age. And like you said, how do you get them to think about the future? I feel like we have short attention spans, right? I think this applies to everybody. Now you think about 2 weeks from now, but you never think about 10 years or 20 years, even 50 years from now. We're just always very impulsive and in the moment. So getting people to think beyond that, it's challenging. And like I said, it has to be a hook or something relevant to them for them to pause, process that information, and start thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully your podcast will get some notoriety, and this would be a great platform, I think, to get people to talk about what we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Having humans some self accountability and respect humans and the future. I think that's a huge thing that people need to start thinking about.
Yeah, that's something that I talk about a lot on the podcast
That's
usually.
good.
Topic
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah, it's important, I think, if people are really concerned about humans and not going extinct in the future. They say we're in a birth decline, um, but yeah, we need a motivation, I think, for us to come together globally to make a difference, and hopefully a positive one.
Yep.
So
All right, Professor. Well, where can people go to help the Dania Beach Vervet project?
they can go to www.daniabeachmonkeys.com.
Excellent.
So, yeah. So the website has a little bit of information about myself and then our vet and the things that we do. And a little bit about the sanctuary itself is on there as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you, Missy. Thank you for your
You're welcome.
time.
Of course, John. Not a problem.
So that was my conversation with Dr. Missy Williams, a professor, anthropologist, conservationist, and director of the Dania Beach Vervet Project. Now I want to transition into something else for the second half of this podcast. As I mentioned in our conversation, I recently read a book on the Taino. It's called The Tainos, Rise and Decline of the People Who Greeted Columbus. I highlighted the most interesting parts of the book and wanted to read some here and talk a little bit more about who the Taino were. So let's get into it. So, yeah, the Taino were everywhere in the Caribbean. I mean, they were in Cuba, mostly central Cuba and eastern Cuba. And then you had them also on Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti and Dominican Republic. You also had them in Jamaica. You had them in Bahama Islands, Puerto Rico. So that's where the Taino are, and smaller islands within that are near the Virgin Islands as well. And then you had other peoples and cultures around the same time as the Tainos. In Cuba, for instance, in the western part of the island, you had the Guanahatabe, who was, a distinct culture to themselves. Near Guadalupe and Barbados, and you had the island Caribe. So that was another group there. And the Taino were very interesting people. They built dwellings. There were dwellings called Caney and Bohio. The Bohio were used by chiefs. Caney were used by non-chiefs, the other people of the society. They built hammocks in front of their canays. They built boats. There's been plenty of artifacts that have been found from around that time. Drums, canoes, fire sticks, certain stone tools, spear tips. Let's see what I can find here. So this is an interesting part here. The West Indies were evidently peopled in two directions. First by Cassimaroid Indians from Middle America, and then by Ortoroid Indians from South America. The former migration began about 4000 BC and the latter about 2000 BC. It appears likely to me that the Cassimiroids originated among peoples in Yucatan peripheral to the Lithic to Archaic age. They took advantage of the Cuban countercurrent to move into Cuba and Hispaniola, but did not colonize any of the other islands. Apparently, they preferred the two largest islands because they were richer in terrestrial and marine resources and were better suited to the practice of seasonal movement from the interior to the coast, which they appear to have brought from Middle America. So we had the two peoples that came from two different directions of the Caribbean, of the West, what they called the West Indies as well. And so you had people entering the western tip of Cuba, and this is the greatest hypothesis of what happened. You had people entering the western tip of Cuba from the Yucatan, from Mexico, on boat. They got there. They used the current that helped them out, and they got there, and they populated Cuba, and also Hispaniola, modern day Haiti, Dominican Republic. And then that was in 4000 BC, so that's 6,000 years ago. And then 2000 BC, you had another people coming from South America. And they came up through the small islands and eventually reached all the way to the biggest island, Cuba. And those were the Ortoroid people. The first ones were the Cassimiroid, and the other ones were the Ortoroids. Present evidence indicates that the Ortoroids were coastal peoples. They arose in Trinidad while it was still attached to the mainland, advanced through the Lesser Antilles and the Virgin Islands, and halted in Puerto Rico. There they established a frontier with the Cassimiroid peoples, which lasted from circa 1000 to 400 BC. That is, until the arrival of the Saladoid forebears of the Tainos. So we're talking about dates here. The Saladoids came after the Cassimiroids. So here we go. The Saladoids who reached the West Indies were probably not moving into unknown territory when they crossed the water gap between Trinidad Tobago and the Lesser Antilles. They must have learned about the existence of islands beyond the gap from Ortoroid Indians who had been trading across it for crystals and other rare commodities. The land north of the gap would have been especially attractive to farmers like the Saladoids because its agricultural potentialities and the other terrestrial resources had not been tapped by their predecessors. So you had two different peoples there before the Tainos populating the Caribbean, the West Indies. And then, so the Saladoids and the Ortoroids, they met at the Mona Passage between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. Then came the Saladoid Indians, subsequently arrived from the interior of South America, introducing the Ceramic Age. They descended the Orinoco Valley to the coast and proceeded out into the West Indies as far as Puerto Rico, where they halted at the Ortoroid-Cassimiroid frontier. The newcomers originally possessed cultures belonging to the Ronquinen Saladoid subseries. Upon reaching the coast, they developed a new subseries called Cedrosan Saladoid, which they carried into the Antilles. There, it eventually gave rise to the culture of the Taino Indians. They also appear to have introduced the linguistic and biological heritage of the Tainos. This part is very interesting to me. because it pertains to kind of what we were talking about on the podcast about, and what I'm gonna be talking about on the next podcast a lot, ethnocentrism. So this chapter is called The Second Repeopling. We humans are ethnocentric, tending to overlook events in which neither we nor our ancestors participated. Columbus's career is a case in point. People of European descent honor the admiral for his discovery of quote-unquote the New World, but give no credit to the Native Americans for having previously found it. From the standpoint of humanity as a whole, it would be more accurate to say that Columbus discovered a new route from Europe to the Americas. Two other routes between the hemispheres had been found before Columbus's time. The ancestors of the American Indians had moved from Siberia into Alaska and the rest of the New World toward the end of the Ice Ages, and the Norse had traveled from Iceland to Greenland and Newfoundland in the 10th century AD. It was the Cassimaroid and Ortoroid Indians who originally discovered and peopled the West Indies. They were the indigenous inhabitants, and as such had the misfortune to be almost entirely exterminated by the Saladoid invaders and their descendants, the Ostionoids. The Ostionoids evolved into the Tainos, who eventually suffered the same fate that their ancestors had inflicted upon the Cassimaroids and Ortoroids. The Tainos, too, were replaced by foreign peoples, including not only colonists from Spain and other European countries, but also the slaves whom the colonists imported from other parts of the Caribbean area and from sub-Saharan Africa. The present chapter is concerned with this second repeopling of the West Indies. The extinctions that took place during the two repeoplings exemplify the process of genocide. During Columbus's first voyage of his 4 voyages to the Americas, he discovered the Tainos, and he traced their limits during the second voyage. And so according to this book, it's hard to exactly place what island Columbus landed in at first. The first island that he encountered, the Tainos. The Tainos called the island Guanahani, and Columbus took possession of it in the name of the King and Queen of Spain and renamed it San Salvador. But the inadequacy of his documentation and the consequent difficulty in plotting his course have made it impossible to determine exactly where he landed. On Columbus's first voyage, he took on board 6 Tainos, intending to teach them Spanish so that they could interpret for him and to carry them to Spain to show to his royal sponsors. They directed him through the inner Bahama Islands to Cuba, where he arrived on October 28th, 1492. This book details Columbus's 4 voyages pretty well. Oh, but look at this. So, on the second voyage, Columbus returned to Hispaniola in 1493. His objectives were not only to rescue the sailors he had left at La Navidad and to complete the exploration of the Greater Antilles, cut short by the shipwreck of the Santa Maria, but also to found a colony on Hispaniola. The king and queen instructed him to establish gold mines, install settlers, develop trade with the Tainos, and convert them to Christianity. They provided him a fleet of 17 ships, abundant supplies, and about 1,500 men, among them Father Ramon Panay, who was to make a study of the Taino religion. No women were on board, since his Taino passengers had told him that the Lesser Antilles extend farther out into the Atlantic than the islands he had previously explored. He expected to be able to make a shorter and quicker passage, and thus he discovered the best route to the West Indies. But this chapter is really enlightening on how the interactions were between Columbus and his crew and the indigenous people of the island at the time. He didn't just come in contact with the Taino, he talked to the island Carib, or talked to them, communicated with them, and also encountered them and committed violence against all these people. Let's see here. So this is how Columbus interacted with Columbus and his folk interacted with the Taino, and how they started this colonization project. They built a string of forts along the corridor and removed the regional and district chiefs to prevent them from organizing resistance against colonial rule. The accounts of these activities provide important insights into the nature of Taino culture. Columbus himself set up the first fort at Santo Tomas during March 1494, intending to use it to defend the northern gold field against the threat of attack by Saunabo, ruler of a chiefdom south of the Cordillera Central, whom he believed to be responsible for the previous destruction of La Navidad. While he was away that summer exploring Cuba and Jamaica, the garrison of the fort began to exploit the local Indians, stealing their possessions and raping the women, just as the occupants of La Navidad seemed to have done before. The Tainos retaliated by destroying their own villages and fields and retreating into the forests. Many of them suffered from hunger as a result. When Columbus returned from his voyage of exploration in the fall of 1494, he sent an emissary, Alonso de Ojeda, to visit Saunabo in an attempt to forestall a possible rebellion. Ojeda captured Saunabo by luring him out of his town with gifts and the offer of a horseback ride. Columbus then shipped him off to Spain. He died of unknown causes during the trip. The revolt that Columbus had feared took place on March 1495. It was led by a coalition of local chiefs that included Saunabo's brothers and was put down with the help of Guacanagari. The cacique who had blamed Scanaubo for the destruction of La Navidad. The opposing chiefs were killed and a number of their followers were captured. Meanwhile, the mines were yielding little gold, and many colonists, dissatisfied with the fruits of their labors, had returned to Spain. The crown complained about the lack of income from the colony. Columbus sent a shipload of captives to Spain to be sold as slaves in a desperate attempt to satisfy that complaint. The slaves proved to be poor workers, unable to resist European diseases, and the crown decided to free them for practical as well as humanitarian reasons. Well, I'd like some sources on all of this here. What the crown decided to free them on, for practical as well as humanitarian reasons. Okay, I'd like to see the sources on that. I mean, it seems like a nice, way to paint it, but maybe. It ordered the surviving Indians to be shipped back to Hispaniola and included for good measure those whom the returning colonists had brought to Spain to serve as their household servants. The remaining rebels were distributed among the colonists and put to work in mining, ranching, or household service. Their ranks were thinned by poor working conditions and a famine in 1495 through 96, which the Spaniards may have brought on by failing to allow the laborers sufficient time for hunting, fishing, and farming. And did you know that Columbus's brother, Bartolome Columbus, governed this colony with him? He governed this colony while his brother was in Spain from 1496 to 1498. Some nepotism? I don't know. Maybe they were just a package deal. I don't know. Now this part, is all about the Tainos too, but it's a lot about what the Europeans did when they got to the island. But I think it's important to detail what we know about the history, because we have written accounts from the Europeans, from the Spanish, and so that's going to color how we understand the history. But this person who wrote this book it seems like they did a pretty good, detailed, fair analysis, but there's certain phrasing and certain ways of trying to understand the past that kind of doesn't sit right with me. But let's see how it goes. Ovando, who was this his name was Nicholas de Ovando, in 1502 brought along 2,500 colonists, including the first European families to arrive in the Americas. So he was also an explorer, shipper, agent for the Spanish government on a colonial mission, and he felt it. So I'm quoting a lot from the book. Ovando felt it necessary to remove the threat to the new settlers that was posed by the surviving hierarchies of chiefs at either end of Hispaniola. He accomplished this task by eliminating the principal caciques, first in the southeastern chiefdom of Iguay, and then in southwestern Saragua. Unlike the Columbus family, he proceeded forcefully and with great brutality. Soon after his arrival in 1502, the Higuay Indians rebelled to avenge the killing of one of their chiefs by a Spanish attack dog. Ovando rounded up 600 or 700 of them, put them in the chief's bohyo, or house, and had them knifed to death. He then ordered their bodies to be dragged into the adjoining plaza and publicly counted. And more atrocities followed. The crown had ordered Ovando to assemble the Indians near the goldfields so that they could more easily be put to work there, but he found it more practicable to refine and expand the practice of repartimiento, assigning whole Indian communities to individual Spanish settlers for use in the goldfields or on ranches. So that was what repartimiento meant to them. Each community had to spend 6 months at work and was then allowed to return to its own village for 6 months of recuperation. The time off was reduced to 4 months as the need for forced labor increased. Ovando named the new system after the encomiendas, or estates, that he had previously administered in Spain. There was, however, a basic difference between the two. The encomiendas of Spain were grants of land. Those of Hispaniola, rights to use the labor of Indian villages. In theory, at least, each village continued to retain title to its land so long as it remained intact. The people were thus able to store cassava in the ground while away at work and to replant it during the rest period. The villagers continued to be led by their chief, who became, in effect, an overseer. The advantage of the encomienda system was that it allowed the Indians to retain their own culture and language, to which they were able to revert during their rest periods. Unfortunately, it did not also ensure their health. They died in the goldfields, as had the Spaniards whom they replaced. They lived under unsanitary conditions, which caused them to contract fevers, and were overworked and undernourished. For example, they were not allowed enough free time to obtain meat and fish, whose protein they needed to supplement the starch provided by their cassava bread and sweet potatoes. Their population declined, and of the many hundreds of thousands who had lived during Columbus's time, only 60,000 were left by the end of Ovando's term as governor in 1509. All of this was taking place on Hispaniola. And of course, the Spaniards adjusted to the tropics and prospered. Their population increased to about 10,000, living in 15 towns distributed throughout the island. Archaeologists have located and excavated many of the towns and have documented their progress on adapting to local conditions. And I found this one interesting because I haven't heard the name Juan Ponce de Leon since I was in elementary school. But we learned about him a little bit in this book. Expansion into Puerto Rico took place shortly before the end of Ovando's tenure as governor. It was led by Juan Ponce de Leon, better known in the United States for his subsequent discovery of Florida. After participating in the Iguaque massacre, he served as translator for a party that traveled across the Mona Passage, explored Puerto Rico, and discovered gold there. In 1508, the crown chose him to pursue those discoveries. He established Spanish settlements near the principal gold fields at San German in the southwestern part of the island and at Capara in the northeast. Capara was later moved to the islet of San Juan, where it became the capital. Cowed by the Iguaque massacre, the local Indians at first allowed themselves to be assigned to encomiendas for work in the mines and in ranches, but they soon rebelled under the leadership of a local cacique, Aguaybana. It is said that Caribs in quotation, from the Virgin and Leeward Islands joined them in the struggle. These were presumably Eastern Tainos. It is unlikely that the classic Tainos of Puerto Rico would have been able to obtain help from their more remote enemies, the island Caribs. Once again, there is reason to believe that the term Carib was being loosely applied to all warlike Indians in the small eastern islands, regardless of their cultural affiliation. So what I find very interesting about this whole chapter is that, if we ever hear about, indigenous populations in regards to European colonization, it's usually the spark notes. It's usually like, yeah, the Europeans brought diseases and they killed off a lot of people, and they just, had more might, and they won, and based off of that and based off of technology and all this type of stuff. But we don't often hear accounts of rebellions, which rebellions goes to the other side of the story. It goes to the history of the people that were there before, and how they did fight and they did honorably try to defend their lands and defend their way of life and their people, and in some aspects did succeed, because it's not like the Taino culture has been erased 100%. Just like in my previous podcast when I was talking about the what was I talking about? The Inca. Just like when I was talking about the Inca, that, they rebelled. They had wars against the Spanish, and so did the Tainos. But because yes, of the technology, of the brutality, of the ingenuity at the time of the Europeans, they and the ruthlessness. I mean, that's the main factor, They won out, and they conquered those lands, and didn't wipe out the cultures completely, but really destroyed these cultures, the Inca, the Taino, and many more. And now it gets even darker. So the Spanish population declined markedly. This happened when they kind of exhausted the gold tap in the islands. Many towns were abandoned as their inhabitants left to seek their fortunes in Mexico in the 1520s and Peru in the 1530s. The West Indies became a backwater whose main function was to supply food to the more developed parts of the Spanish Empire and to service the fleets traveling to and from the mother country. The number of Tainos in the encomiendas continued to fall. A census taken in 1514 recorded only 22,726 persons able to work. Some Indians, discouraged by their lot, committed suicide, hanging themselves or poisoning themselves with cassava juice. Many died in a smallpox epidemic of 1519. Others fled into uninhabited territory or took refuge among the island Caribs. In one instance, and remember the island Caribs, it was a different culture, a different indigenous tribe at that point. They didn't have, as far as this guy is concerned, they didn't have great relationships. They didn't have a great relationship with the island Carib, so they were forced into the island Carib territory. In one instance, an encomienda led by a cacique named Enriquillo escaped to the interior of Hispaniola in 1519 and successfully maintained its independence until the crown finally pardoned it in 1533. The number of Tainos in the encomiendas was reduced by outmarriage as well as by flight. There was a shortage of Spanish women in the colony, and unlike Northern Europeans, the Spanish men had no prejudice against marrying into another ethnic group. According to the census of 1514, 40% of the Spanish men had Indian wives. These women and their children were lost to the encomiendas. The Spaniards compensated for the decline of the encomiendas by increasing the importation of Indian slaves from other parts of the Caribbean area and black slaves from Africa. By 1524, when Diego Columbus completed his term as viceroy, there were more slaves than Tainos, and by 1540, the former had almost completely replaced the latter. The slaves introduced new customs. For example, the mainland Indians brought with them the processing of corn into flour, bread, and beer. Little research has been done on the archaeology of the conquest period Tainos. So far as I'm aware, only one encomienda site has been definitely identified, Hacienda Grande, just east of San Juan in Puerto Rico. Its Indians were assigned to Ponce de Leon, who put them to work searching for gold in the Toa Valley on the opposite side of the town of San Juan. Carib raiders attacked them while they were back in their home village during a rest period, killing their cacique, Luisa, and a Spanish official who had come to return them to the gold field. The sites with Spanish colonial artifacts around the East Cuban side of Holguin may also have been occupied by encomienda Indians. No colonial artifacts that I know of have been found at Hacienda Grande. It is possible that the inhabitants reverted to their own culture when they returned to the site during their rest periods, and while there used only native artifacts. So let me read this part here. Epilogue: The Taino's role in the Columbian exchange. The Taino people emerged during the latter part of the first millennium AD and reached maturity about 1200, succumbed to the effects of overwork, malnutrition, epidemics of introduced diseases, rebellion, emigration, and outmarriage. By 1524, I just don't understand this part about the Bassoons succumbed to the effects of rebellion. That's a weird way to put it. Succumb to the effects of rebellion. I was waiting in this list for the violence, and there it is, the rebellion. But that's not why they died. I mean, they died because of the inhumane slavery and the explicit killings and the massacres and the and the torture. By 1524, they had ceased to exist as a separate population group. Parts of their biological, cultural, and linguistic heritages have nevertheless survived in the former Spanish colonies, or have been revived during their present century. Before departing from the scene, they transmitted a number of biological, cultural, and linguistic traits to the Spaniards, who in turn passed them down onto their neighbors, once they spread throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. The historian Alfred W. Crosby Jr. has termed this process the Columbian exchange. Biological traits. The flow of human genes was almost entirely one way, from the Eastern to the Western Hemisphere. Cultural traits. The Tainos played a greater role in the exchange of foods, especially to tropical peoples of the Eastern Hemisphere. Slave traders carried their principal crop, cassava, which is Taino cassave, to sub-Saharan Africa. It was widely adopted there because of its high yield, ability to survive for a long time in storage, and adaptability to savanna areas too dry for the local crops. In effect, it touched off an agricultural revolution and an accompanying population explosion. Cassava was slower to reach India and Southeast Asia, but eventually became a staple food there in areas unsuitable for local crops like rice. Because Indian corn, maize, grows well under temperate, not just tropical, conditions, the Spaniards were able to introduce it into their own country once it spread to the rest of the Mediterranean basin and to Central Europe. It serves mainly as cattle feed, a use to which it was presumably adapted on the cattle ranches established by the conquistadors in Hispaniola. We are indebted to the Tainos for a number of other food crops, including the sweet potato, bean, squash, and peanut, and for fruits like the guava, mamey, and pineapple. Which, that was very interesting when I heard that, because I love sweet potato. Squash is dope. Peanuts, everybody, has tried a peanut. You love them, you hate them. And the fruits, come on, guava is one of the best, and pineapple is one of the best. Mamey, I don't know much about mamey, maybe it was actually grew up in Cuba, I would know, but the Tainos also contributed rubber and tobacco to the Columbian exchange. Peoples throughout the world have emulated the Tainos in developing rubber ball games and courts on which to play them. Cubans have been leaders in the production of cigars, tobacco, since pre-Columbian time. To think that the Tainos and other indigenous people, are partly or the genesis of the idea of using balls in sports is something to really think about. Like, that's really interesting. That's a big part of modern culture, is sport and ball sports, and the Taino had ball sports, so the people were here already, and it wasn't a new world, it was just new to the Europeans, but they stole a lot, and the Tainos had a lot to contribute to this world. Europeans were fascinated by the apparent simplicity of life among the Lusayans, the first Tainos encountered by Columbus. Peter Martyr thought that it confirmed the classical belief in an initial golden age in which humans retained their original innocence, had not yet developed private property and social controls, and consequently lived in a state of complete happiness. Well, Peter Martyr was thinking on some things, It's kind of interesting. I have to look into that. Conclusions. The Spaniards were not the first European people to come into sustained contact with Native Americans. The Norse had reached North America 500 years earlier, advancing along a circumpolar route. Eric the Red colonized the southern part of Greenland, and several of his followers, among them his son Leif, briefly voyaged to the northern tip of Newfoundland, where they encountered Indians or Eskimos. During the 13th century, Eskimos from northern Greenland settled alongside the Norse farms in the southern part of the island. The two peoples lived side by side until the time of Columbus, when the Norse perished during a little ice age that destroyed their pastures. The Eskimos survived thanks to their reliance on hunting and fishing. The Norse and Eskimo remains show only a minimal exchange of traits, even though they coexisted as independent peoples 3 times as long as the Tainos and the Spaniards did. The two populations kept to themselves. Moreover, they were too remote and too peripheral to have affected the centers of development in Europe and the Americas. The Tainos and the Spaniards, on the contrary, happened to live on the most direct route across the Atlantic Ocean at a time when advances in navigation opened up the possibility of round-trip voyages. The two groups interacted so strongly that they merged to form a new mestizo people. Even though Taino race, culture, and language became extinct in the process, individual Taino traits have survived, differentiating the Spanish West Indians from their British, Dutch, and French West Indians. Extinct is an interesting word because if you say that individual Taino traits survived, but you're also saying the race, the culture, and the language became extinct, then it's not entirely extinct, but yeah, a lot was lost. and that's the shame of all of this colonization process, it's like, is conquering, is killing, I'm talking too much about that aspect. The Tainos were very interesting people, and we don't have to get lost in the dregs of history. We can also focus on what still remains and what can keep going of these people from here on out. And there's a lot. And I think that the modern indigenous movements, or the fights to reclaim culture and identity and rights to live in your own land, that's getting hotter right now. That's getting hotter. You see it in Puerto Rico. You've always seen it in Cuba. You see it in different places. So that's the last thing I have to say about the Taino. I think that's enough. So check out the Anthrotographer on Substack and YouTube, Spotify, Apple. And that's it. Reach out anytime.